Hello everyone and welcome. Today in this first video of 2021, I thought what better way to start off the new year than revisit a build I started way back towards the beginning of this channel, the 1/24 scale 1991 Pontiac Firebird drift missile. Starting with some custom 3D printed drivetrain components and a cheap model car from eBay, I began building one of the most scale vehicles I've ever made. Not just a great looking drift missile style body, but also a very scale undercarriage, drivetrain, and suspension. The trade-off for all the scale goodness is that the car has been a huge pain to build and get working right. I've made quite a few videos showcasing this build, maybe a few too many as I've had to rebuild multiple parts of the car, but regardless, if you want to catch up on this project, I'll put the link to the playlist below in the description. To make a long story short, it's a 1/24 scale monogram 91 Firebird formula with a lot of custom designed and 3D printed parts. I wanted to make the car as scale as possible, going with a torque arm rear suspension and a modified McPherson strut front suspension. As a result, the car's driftability isn't great, but it's a trade-off I'm willing to make. It's fun to drive, and I've already done some serious work on this car. At this point, I just want to slap in the interior and call it a day with this build. I've done quite a bit of work to the car off camera. Probably the biggest thing is I've basically rewired all of the electronics. What I did was I used a thinner gauge wire than some of the stuff that I had on there previously. The idea is this smaller gauge wire is going to take up less space, going to be easier to kind of fit around the interior, get everything to fit. The only thing is it's not always a great idea to go with too thin of a gauge wire for some of the electronics for obvious reasons of it not being able to handle enough current. I don't think we'll have any problems here, but at least from the preliminary testing that I did, everything seems to be okay. So I'm going to take it out, run a few batteries through it, do some driving, and hope it doesn't catch on fire. So let's go do it. And with that utmost confidence, I hit the track. Well, not exactly a track, but you know what I mean. Although admittedly not much of a drifter, the car does drive surprisingly well, considering how much of a hodgepodge it sort of is, with it being half model and half RC, rather than having a body sitting on top of a proper RC chassis like with many of my other builds. It tracks straight, has good power, I really can't complain. It does have a gyro integrated into the receiver, however for this drive I had it turned off. Although I'm not sure I necessarily recommend using smaller gauge wire like I did here, I did not have any issues. Nothing got hot, it never stopped working. It'll make cramming everything in along with the interior much easier. Well, relatively easier. And hey, speaking of interior, with the car functioning great, I think it's time to move on to making the inside of the body look a little less empty. So I'm going to need to modify the interior. The biggest thing is I'm going to need to cut out this rear section. I was noticing when I was doing some test fits that it comes into contact right here with this area on the receiver. So I'm going to have to cut out this rear section, just lift that up a little bit. And I've also been thinking where I'm going to put the battery. So originally I thought I'd put the battery somewhere in the back. However, I made the rear panel to make it look just like the real car when you remove the bumper and the tail lights. That kind of takes up some of the area that would have been occupied by the battery. So after doing a lot of test fitting and messing around with it, I think I'm gonna have to go ahead and put the battery like somewhere here where the rear seats go. The less hacking the better, obviously, but at some point something's gotta give and you gotta make it all fit without driving myself completely crazy. So what the plan is right now is I'm going to cut out this rear section here, and then I'm also, along with that, going to cut out the rear seats. There's going to be a big opening here. And rather than just leaving a big opening, I'm thinking I'm going to make some kind of cover. Basically go over, just flat, up like this, and then kind of straight down, just behind where the front seats will be. So it'll kind of go down right behind where the front seats will go. So something like that. And that cover inside of that is the battery's gonna sit in there.
So as I said, I'll be making a cover that will go over the back. I'll use a stripped down race car interior like this, sort of as inspiration on how to make it look. However, there's more than just making room for the battery that I need to keep in mind. This body is a pain to remove from and attach to the chassis. It's not like my other builds where the body is just held on using magnets and the chassis can easily be separated. I'll need to figure out some way for the battery to be removable, or at least the cables can be accessed from the rear window. I won't be adding any glass in the rear, but I'll also need to make some kind of door or have a section of the cover be removable.
As far as the appearance of the interior goes, like the steering wheel, the gauges, and all that, this dash piece is pretty firmly in place. I'm not going to try to tear it out and modify it that way. What I'm going to do is I think I'm just going to cut, either 3D printer cut a piece of styrene just to glue over top of the dash and over top of the radio and the climate controls, maybe add some gauges to that. Make it look a little more like a kind of a race car, drift car interior. Gonna swap out the steering wheel one way or another. It's on there good. I'm gonna have to remove the armrests because, as you may recall, got this awesome roll cage 3D printed that's gonna be going inside the interior. In order to get that roll cage to fit perfectly, I'm gonna have to remove those armrests. This roll cage here on the right was printed using an SLA 3D printer. Previously, as you might recall from some of the earlier videos, I printed a prototype, if you will, of the cage using an FDM printer. And I did trim up the bottom pipes there a little bit so it would fit in correct. So it's looking like I'll have to trim this one just a little bit. But after a little bit of sanding and some paint, this cage is gonna look awesome. I think when it comes to some of this custom RC building stuff like this, it's like 80% just sitting here staring at everything and kind of coming up with an idea or a plan, figuring out how everything's gonna kind of mesh together. But I think we got a pretty solid plan right now, so I think it's time to get all of the sharp tools and get hacking.
Before I began cutting the interior to fit the chassis, I noticed that the screws used to hold the transmission crossmember were sticking out just enough to make the front of the interior not sit flat against the chassis, so I ground them down. Once that was done, I used a hot knife to cut out the rear of the interior. As you can see, the interior now fits perfectly with this section removed. The edge left behind is rough, so I used a file and hobby knife to clean up the edge and make it smooth.
Alright, so I've got the hole cut in the back, and as you can see, got plenty of room now for all the stuff in the rear. Gonna make some kind of cover to go over that. But before I do that, I want to get this roll cage. I want to cut the bottoms off of it so it's in place before I go ahead and make any sort of rear cover. So I'm going to use this, measure it on here, cut it, and then should be good. Alright, so I've got these two legs, if you will, of the roll cage trim down so it'll fit just like that. The thickness of the windshield in the front kind of pushes it down a little bit more than what would be ideal. It seems to be fitting all right. Might need to take it down just another millimeter or so. However, if we have a look at the seats, I'm thinking about kind of keeping with the drift missile style, putting a race seat in the driver's seat and just a regular factory seat for the passenger side. But as you'll see, when I put this roll cage into place, so the OEM seat fits all right in there. That's not going to be a problem. You might need to take just a little bit off the right side. It's kind of a tight squeeze between the bar and the seat. However, the racing seat on the driver's side is just not quite fitting like I want it. So I think what I'm going to do is modify the STL file, make it a little bit shorter, kind of cut the bottom off of it, and then print that, because as you can see, it's just a little bit too tall. And that's the beauty of 3D printing. I can kind of cut the bottom off of it. I could scale it. Instead of doing a uniform scale, I could just scale it on the Z-axis just to make it fit inside. So I'm gonna print a similar racing seat with a few tweaks so it'll fit in there. But the roll cage has been cut. It's fitting how I like it. So now, before I move too far ahead with the seats and the interior and getting the roll cage painted, I want to start working on this rear cover. How are we going to cover up the chassis? And don't forget, we have to fit this battery in here as well. Also need to put something. I don't want that battery resting on the drive shaft or the suspension or anything like that. So I'm gonna have to put something down in here, like a floor, for the battery to sit on. Yeah, probably just more or less like a flat sheet to go up and around from the back of the interior tub to the back side of the roll cage. Not sure if it's gonna look the best, but it'll work. It'll look better than how it does right now for sure. Off to a good start. I'd say just have to come up with some kind of cover to go over the back. Get a little creative with that, and let's see what we can come up with.
Before I could begin the design, I needed to get some measurements. With those measurements in hand, I used Autodesk Fusion 360 to design the cover. There isn't really anything special about the design, I just wanted to make sure that a section of the cover could be removed so the battery can come out. I made a little section that sticks out of the top so I could reach in with pliers to remove the cover. I'll use 2 M1 screws to secure the cover to the rest of the interior. Despite these being pretty specific parts, I will be posting them on a Patreon in case anyone has a use for them.
So while the parts that I just designed are currently being printed, I'm going to go ahead and I've got just a little scrap piece of very thin styrene. Just going to cover up this drive shaft right here so when the battery is sitting in place, it doesn't rub up against the drive shaft or anything like that. So yeah, basically just cut a small piece, glue it into place on the chassis. That should be good enough just to keep the battery from coming into contact with the drive shaft.
After bending the styrene a bit so it would fit over the drive shaft, I painted it flat black to match the rest of the chassis. I also touched up some areas on the chassis that needed paint. Back over to the printer, the rear cover is ready and looks great. After a little final sanding, I glued the cover in place. I also printed this piece that will go behind the front seats and glued it into place. There's now enough room in the rear for the receiver and battery. I did need to trim a little off the back legs of the roll cage so it would fit low enough in the interior. Although it might not be the best looking, it definitely looks better than having a giant hole and provides enough space for the electronics.
So at this point, I've got the rear cover in place. I've also got this little back panel put in as well. And I've trimmed up the roll cage so that it sits down in the interior, and the interior with the roll cage fits the body. So at this point, really all that's left to do is the fun stuff, put in the seats, customize the interior. But I think the next thing I'm gonna do is get sanding on the roll cage. As you can see, I want to do a little bit of cleanup from where those supports were when it was being printed.
After sanding, I applied some primer and then paint. I chose red to help make the roll cage stand out.
This cage turned out looking awesome. I really like that red color. It's gonna look awesome in the finished car. What I wanna move on to next is working on fitting the seats. I'm also going to be customizing the dashboard a little bit. I'm gonna try to put on a different steering wheel as well. As I discussed earlier, the driver's seat doesn't quite wanna fit. It's a little bit too tall. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go into CAD and modify the seat a bit. I'm gonna kind of cut the bottom off. I'm gonna scale it so it's a little bit shorter and it'll fit the car better. Before I head on over to the computer, I also want to take a few measurements of the dash. I'm gonna be making a custom piece, kind of to look a little bit more like a bare bones race car or purpose-built drift car. Gonna make a piece that just fits right over top. Gonna do it over the climate controls on the radio as well as this instrument panel here. So just want to get a few measurements, take that over into Fusion 360 and get designing.
With the measurements I needed, I opened up Autodesk Fusion 360 and began by modifying the racing seat. I want to demonstrate how easily you can modify the seat so that it will fit. If, for example, you've downloaded some accessory STL file off of our Patreon page, but it doesn't quite fit your car, you can modify the size and make simple edits to it so that it works for your project. That's one of the awesome things about 3D printing. Using Fusion 360's mesh editing tools, I could easily chop off the bottom of the seat so it sits a little lower and at a slightly more reclined angle, as well as scale the model to be a different size. You can scale the model uniformly, like if you wanted to take a 1/10 scale racing seat and bring it down to a 1/24 scale size, or also non-uniformly, meaning that you can shrink or enlarge the model along one of the three axes independently, as I did to make the seat just a little narrower and shorter. As long as you don't overdo it, the seat still looks great and it will fit the car. This is one of those times where 3D printing really comes in handy versus buying something off the shelf. Sure, you can cut up a seat to fit, but being able to tweak the exact length, width, and height, as well as effortlessly remove sections to your heart's desire is really nice. After modifying the seat, I designed the dash panel and switch panel, as well as a tachometer and handbrake. I didn't bother adding much detail because they're so small. 3D printers have limits to how much tiny details can be printed, plus being in the interior, they won't be too visible, though I do think they'll be a nice addition to the car. I also shrunk down a previously released racing steering wheel that was posted as a 1/10 scale model on Patreon. I just shrunk it down so that it fits this 1/24 scale Firebird. Like the cover, all of these models will be posted on the Patreon. I printed them using an SLA 3D printer. These will probably be too small to print on a typical FDM printer, so if you want to make a set of your own in 1/24 scale, keep this in mind. For the seat, I used a conventional FDM 3D printer. If you don't have a printer capable of making these small parts, I will also be posting them onto our Shapeways store. Shapeways can print a wide variety of parts in a wide variety of different materials and with great detail. I'll be sure to post that link below in the description. The parts that I have here came out looking awesome, and I can't wait to get them painted and installed in the car, along with adding some under the hood details like the engine cover, radiator, and exhaust. Also, I want to add some kind of rear bumper. The one that I made before replicating the real one doesn't quite fit the chassis piece right, so I'm going to be making something custom to go on the rear. After all that's done, I think that will about do it. Maybe add some decals? I don't know. Let me know if there's something that I'm forgetting below in the comments. I'll be covering the final steps of completing this car in an upcoming video, so be sure to stay tuned for that. I want to give a huge shout out and thank you to all our patrons and channel members. The support lately has honestly been unreal. I feel a little bad I haven't been able to put out much content recently, as right now so many people are supporting this channel. But in light of this, I have decided over the next few weeks leading up to the Ultimate Scale Truck Expo in February, I'm going to really be putting in some serious time into making content for this channel since so many people have been willing to contribute monetarily. This channel is and has been a hobby for me, basically something I do at 1 AM after all the day's work has been done, but if people are going to be supporting the channel like they have been lately, I have no problem making YouTube into a proper part-time gig and actually devoting some serious hours every week to making videos. Seriously guys, thank you so much. I'm also very excited for some updates coming to Make It RC as a whole in 2021. I made a little blog post talking about our future plans, which I'll be sure to link below in the description. I know reading sucks, but I posted some pretty pictures, and if you read it in my voice, it's almost like watching a video. Sort of. Alright, not really, but it's there if you're interested. And I'll admit, although I may have been slacking when it comes to working on my RCs, clearly you all haven't, as evidenced by the awesome work you all have been showcasing in the Make It RC Facebook group. Thanks everyone for sharing, I'm always inspired seeing your work, and if you'd like to show off your vehicle or project, please feel free to join, the link is below. That's going to be all for this video. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.